Commander Zekathara stood on the bridge of his war cruiser and watched the small blue planet spin slowly below him. His four eyes tracked the primitive ships that moved between the planet and its single moon. The humans called this world Earth, and they had just been discovered by the Galactic Coalition 3 weeks ago. Zekathara had seen this same scene play out dozens of times before with other new species. First contact, evaluation, then integration into the greater galactic community. It was all very routine. The Catherian commander had fought in 17 different wars across the galaxy over his 300 years of life. His people were known as the greatest warriors in Coalition space. Their gray-scaled skin could stop most energy weapons, and their natural speed made them deadly in close combat. Zekathara had personally killed over 2,000 enemy soldiers in various conflicts. War was what his species did best, and it was what made them valuable to the Coalition. Today he was here as a military observer. The Coalition Council wanted detailed reports on every new species they encountered. They needed to know if these humans would be useful allies or potential threats. So far, the humans seemed harmless enough. Their technology was centuries behind most Coalition species. Their weapons were simple projectile devices that fired metal slugs. Their ships barely qualified as space-worthy and moved slower than most. Cargo vessels. Zekathara had read the initial contact reports. The humans had been found on a frontier world called New Montana, where they were mining basic metals. When the Coalition survey team landed, the humans had been excited rather than afraid. They immediately wanted to know about other species in the galaxy. They asked hundreds of questions about trade, technology, and culture. The survey team classified them as Category 3, which meant minimal threat level. A communication alert sounded on his bridge. The human leader wanted to speak with him directly. Zekathara activated the main screen and saw a middle-aged human male in a blue uniform. The man had short gray hair and calm blue eyes. According to the files, this was Admiral Jake Morrison of something called the Terran Defense Force. Admiral Morrison smiled when he saw Zekathara on the screen. Most species found Catherians intimidating with their towering frames and predator features, but this human seemed completely at ease. Morrison spoke in accented galactic standard, which most species learned for intersystem communication. Commander Zekathara, thank you for taking my call. I wanted to personally invite you and your crew down to Earth. We would be honored to show you our world and share what we can offer the Coalition. Zekathara studied the human carefully. In his experience, most new species were either terrified of first contact or tried to appear more powerful than they actually were. Morrison did neither. He seemed genuinely friendly and confident without being aggressive. It was unusual behavior that made the Catherian curious. What exactly do you believe your species can contribute to the Coalition, Admiral Morrison? Zekathara asked in his deep, rumbling voice. Morrison's smile widened. We're excellent at solving problems, Commander. Humans have always been good at adapting to difficult situations. We learn fast and we work well with others. I think you'll find we can be very useful allies. Over the next several hours, Zekathara toured the human capital city. The buildings were primitive by galactic standards but showed efficient design. The humans had clean cities, functional transportation, and seemed to live in relative harmony, despite having over 200 different nations on their planet. Morrison explained that humans had only recently stopped fighting major wars against each other and were now focused on space exploration. What impressed Zekathara most was how quickly the humans grasped Coalition technology. The engineers and scientists he met asked intelligent questions and seemed to understand complex concepts after only brief explanations. Within days of receiving basic Coalition computer systems, the humans had figured out how to integrate them with their existing networks. The humans were also surprisingly generous. They offered to share their agricultural techniques, which produced food more efficiently than many Coalition worlds. They provided detailed star charts of their local space region. Most importantly, they volunteered to contribute soldiers and ships to coalition peacekeeping forces even though their military was small and poorly equipped. Admiral Morrison personally escorted Zekthara through their military facilities. The human soldiers were disciplined and professional, but used equipment that was hundreds of years behind coalition standard. Their tactics were basic, and their ships had no energy shields or advanced weapons. By any military measure, they were completely outclassed by even the weakest coalition species. Yet something about the humans puzzled Zekthara. During his tour of their military history museum, he learned that humans had been fighting wars continuously for thousands of years. They had weapons designed specifically to kill other humans and had developed incredibly sophisticated strategies for large-scale combat. Their history was filled with conflicts that killed millions of their own people. For a species that claimed to be peaceful, they certainly had extensive experience with violence. When Zekthara asked Morrison about this apparent contradiction, the Admiral's expression became more serious. "We learned the hard way that war solves very little, Commander. Humans are capable of terrible things when we fight each other. That's exactly why we're so eager to join the coalition. We want to use our energy for building things instead of destroying them." Zekthara filed his report 3 days later. The humans were classified as enthusiastic but harmless newcomers who could provide useful resources and basic military support. Their technology was primitive, their weapons were outdated, and their ships were slow. They posed no threat to coalition security and could be valuable trading partners. The Council approved immediate integration and assigned the humans several frontier colonies to develop. As his ship left Earth's orbit, Zekthara watched the blue planet fade into the distance. He had seen dozens of species join the coalition. Over the years, most followed predictable patterns of development and integration. The humans seemed destined for the same quiet, peaceful existence as other minor coalition members. They would mine asteroids, grow food, and provide basic support services while the major powers handled galactic security. Zekthara had no way of knowing that in just a few months, everything he thought he understood about warfare would be completely wrong. The emergency alert reached Zekthara while he was reviewing training reports in his quarters. Coalition Command was scrambling every available ship to respond to a massive attack on Kepler Station. The message was brief but alarming. 3 full Veltar battle groups had appeared without warning and were assaulting the border station. All coalition forces in the area were to respond immediately. Zekthara had fought the Veltar before and knew what this meant. The Veltar hegemony was the most ruthless empire in known space. They conquered worlds not just for resources, but for the pleasure of domination. Veltar soldiers were bred for cruelty, and their commanders took pride in breaking the spirits of their enemies. When they attacked a station like Kepler, they would kill all defenders and enslave the civilian population. It was their standard operating procedure, and they were very good at it. Kepler Station housed over 2 million beings from dozens of different coalition species. It served as both a major trading hub and a gateway to the frontier colonies. The station had basic defensive systems and a small security force, but nothing that could stand against 3 Veltar battle groups. By the time any relief force arrived, the Veltar would be long gone with their prizes. As his ship jumped to hyperspace, Zekthara calculated the timeline in his head. The attack had begun 6 hours ago. Even traveling at maximum speed, his fleet would need another 4 hours to reach Kepler Station. The Veltar typically needed only 8 hours to strip a station of valuables and process the survivors for slave markets. With any luck, some coalition forces might still be fighting when they arrived, but Zekthara expected to find smoking wreckage and empty space. The human colony on Kepler Station had been established just 2 months earlier. 50,000 humans had volunteered to help expand coalition presence in the frontier region. They brought their families and had started farms and workshops throughout the civilian sections. According to the reports, Admiral Morrison had personally selected the colonists and appointed a former military officer named Alex Carter to lead them. When Zekthara's fleet dropped out of hyperspace near Kepler Station, he prepared for the worst. Instead, he found something impossible. The Veltar battle groups were gone. Not retreated or regrouping, but completely destroyed. Debris from dozens of warships drifted in expanding clouds around the station. Energy signatures indicated massive explosions and weapons fire, but the station itself was still intact and transmitting, normally. Coalition Command was flooding the communication channels with confused reports from other ships arriving at the scene. No one understood what had happened. 3 Veltar battle groups represented over 60 heavy warships and 30,000 elite soldiers. Nothing at Kepler Station should have been able to stop them, much less destroy them completely. Zekthara docked his ship at the station and immediately headed for the command center. The corridors showed clear signs of recent fighting. Blast marks covered the walls, and emergency repair teams were still working to restore damaged systems. But the station was operational, and civilians were moving freely through the passages. Whatever had happened here, it had ended in complete coalition. Victory! The command center was controlled by humans. Alex Carter stood at the central console coordinating repair efforts, while human technicians monitored station systems. Carter was a compact man with gray hair and steady hands. He wore simple work clothes stained with grease and what looked like blood. When he saw Zekthara approaching, he looked up with tired eyes. "Commander Zekthara, I assume. Thank you for responding so quickly. We could have used your help about 6 hours ago, but we managed to handle things ourselves." Zekthara stared at the human in disbelief. "You handled 3 Veltar battle groups by yourself? How is that possible? The station's defenses are minimal, and you have no heavy weapons." Carter's expression remained neutral. "We improvised. The Veltar made some tactical errors, and we took advantage of them. Would you like a detailed briefing on what happened?" Over the next hour, Carter explained the battle with the calm professionalism of an experienced soldier. When the Veltar attacked, they had followed their standard procedure. First, they destroyed the station's external defenses with long-range weapons. Then they docked assault ships directly to the hull and sent boarding parties to capture key areas. They expected minimal resistance from frightened civilians and lightly armed security forces. Instead, they found humans who had transformed the entire station into a combat zone. Every corridor had been turned into a killing field, with improvised explosive devices and hidden firing positions. The humans had used maintenance tunnels to move unseen throughout the station. They had sabotaged Veltar equipment and turned the invaders' own weapons against them. Most importantly, the humans had shown no mercy. Carter explained this part with the same neutral tone he used for everything else. When Veltar soldiers tried to surrender, the humans shot them. When enemy commanders attempted to negotiate, the humans killed them. When boarding parties tried to retreat back to their ships, the humans followed them and destroyed the vessels from within. "But Commander," Zekthara interrupted, "the Veltar had numerical superiority and better equipment. How did 50,000 colonists defeat 30,000 elite soldiers?" Carter looked directly at the Catherian warrior. "Because we weren't fighting to capture territory or take prisoners, Commander. We were fighting to kill every single one of them before they could hurt our families. That changes the mathematics considerably." Zekthara spent the rest of the day investigating the battle site. The evidence was overwhelming and disturbing. The humans had indeed killed every single Veltar soldier on the station. They had used weapons and tactics that were crude but devastatingly effective. More importantly, they had coordinated their defense with a level of tactical sophistication that surprised even experienced coalition military officers. The human civilians had participated directly in the fighting. Engineers had built bombs from industrial equipment. Farmers had used agricultural tools as weapons. Even children had served as scouts and messengers during the battle. The entire human population had functioned as a single military unit, despite having no formal training or preparation for such an event. When Zekthara asked Carter how this was possible, the human leader's answer was simple. "Every adult human on this station served in our military at some point. We may be farmers and engineers now, but we remember our training. More importantly, we understand what happens to our families if we lose. The final piece of evidence came from the Veltar flagship, which had been captured intact. Human boarding. Parties had fought their way through the entire ship and killed the crew in hand-to-hand combat. The bridge showed signs of a particularly violent struggle. According to Carter's report, the Veltar commander had been alive when they reached him and had tried to surrender. The humans had killed him anyway. As Zekthara prepared his report for Coalition Command, he struggled with what he had witnessed. The humans had achieved a military victory that should have been impossible. They had done it using primitive weapons and basic tactics. Most disturbing of all, they had shown a level of ruthlessness that exceeded even the Veltar reputation for cruelty. When Admiral Morrison arrived 2 days later to inspect the colony, Zekthara met with him privately. Morrison listened to the battle report without emotion, then asked a single question. Were there any Coalition casualties among the civilian population? None, Zekthara replied. Your people protected everyone else on the station. Morrison nodded, slowly. Good. That's what they were supposed to do. As Morrison prepared to leave, Zekthara had to ask the question that had been bothering him since the battle ended. Admiral, your people showed no mercy to the Veltar. They killed prisoners and ignored surrender attempts. That violates every galactic warfare convention. Morrison's expression became cold. Commander, the Veltar came here to murder civilians and enslave survivors. They showed up with overwhelming force expecting easy victims. My people gave them exactly the war they wanted. The only difference is they didn't expect to lose. Zekthara watched Morrison's ship leave the station and wondered what other surprises humanity might have in store for the galaxy. News of the Kepler Station massacre spread through Veltar space like wildfire. War Master Thokvai received the reports in his throne room aboard the flagship Bone Crusher. 3 battle groups destroyed, 30,000 elite soldiers dead. Not a single human casualty reported. The number seemed impossible, but multiple sources confirmed the same basic facts. A handful of primitive colonists had annihilated the largest Veltar assault force assembled in decades. Thokvai had built his reputation on crushing species that dared to resist Veltar expansion. His forces had enslaved 17 different worlds and broken the military power of dozens of Coalition species. The idea that humans could defeat his soldiers was not just insulting, it was dangerous. If word spread that Veltar forces could be beaten by primitive colonists, other species might find the courage to resist. That could not be allowed to happen. The War Master issued orders that reached every Veltar commander in the frontier regions. Humanity was now designated as a priority target. All human colonies would be attacked simultaneously using maximum force. No prisoners would be taken and no mercy would be shown. The humans would serve as an example to remind the galaxy why. Resisting the Veltar was futile. Zekthara learned of the Veltar response through Coalition intelligence networks. The scale of the planned offensive was unprecedented. Nearly half the Veltar fleet was being redirected to attack human settlements. The assault would begin with orbital bombardment of major population centers, followed by ground invasions designed to capture survivors for public execution. It was psychological warfare designed to break human morale completely. Coalition Command offered to reinforce human colonies with additional defensive forces, but Admiral Morrison politely declined. The humans preferred to handle their own defense, he explained. They had been analyzing Veltar tactics since the Kepler Station attack and believed they understood how to counter future assaults. Morrison requested only intelligence updates and detailed information about Veltar ship capabilities. The first wave of attacks began 3 weeks later. Zekthara monitored the battles from Coalition headquarters and watched as 6 human colonies came under simultaneous assault. The Veltar used their standard doctrine of overwhelming firepower followed by brutal ground operations. What they found waiting for them was unlike anything in their previous experience. The human colony on Darwin Prime was the first to be attacked. Two Veltar battle groups arrived expecting to find frightened farmers and basic defensive systems. Instead, they encountered a fortress world where every building had been converted into a defensive position. The humans had spent weeks preparing killing fields, establishing overlapping fields of fire, and creating underground tunnel networks that allowed them to strike from unexpected directions. Colonel Lisa Parker commanded the Darwin Prime Defense. A former Special Forces officer, she had organized the colonists into military units and taught them advanced combat techniques in just 3 weeks. When the Veltar landed their assault troops, they found humans who fought with a coordination and ferocity that surprised even veteran soldiers. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it ended, every Veltar soldier on the planet was dead, and their orbital fleet had been destroyed by improvised weapons launched from hidden facilities on the surface. Parker's after-action report was brief and professional, but the casualty figures told the real story. Human losses were minimal, while Veltar casualties were total. Similar results came from the other attacked colonies. General Ben Hughes at New Sacramento had used industrial equipment to create massive explosive devices that crippled Veltar ships before they could land troops. The colony on Riverside had poisoned their water supplies with chemicals that were harmless to humans, but deadly to Veltar biology. Most disturbing to galactic observers, the humans had taken prisoners at 3 locations and were conducting detailed interrogations to learn more about their enemies. Zekthara traveled to Coalition Command to review the intelligence reports with senior military officials. The data was disturbing not because of human casualties, but because of the tactical evolution he was witnessing. In just 3 weeks, the humans had transformed from primitive colonists into sophisticated military forces. They were learning Veltar weaknesses faster than anyone thought possible and adapting their strategies with remarkable efficiency. War Master Thokavai's response to these defeats was predictably brutal. If conventional tactics could not break human resistance, then he would use methods that violated every galactic warfare convention. Veltar scientists began developing biological weapons specifically designed to target human physiology. Their psychological warfare specialists prepared broadcasts featuring the torture of captured Coalition civilians. Most ominously, Thokavai ordered the deployment of planet-killer weapons against human worlds. The Coalition Council held emergency sessions to address the escalating conflict. Most species called for immediate intervention to prevent the war from spreading. The Cytherian representative argued that humans had proven themselves capable defenders and should be left to handle their own affairs. Others worried that Veltar brutality would eventually overwhelm human resistance and create a humanitarian crisis. Admiral Morrison attended these council sessions as the human representative. Zekthara observed him carefully during the debates and noticed changes in the Admiral's demeanor. Morrison remained polite and professional, but there was something different in his eyes. When other delegates spoke of negotiating with the Veltar or finding peaceful solutions, Morrison listened with an expression that seemed almost amused. During a private conversation, Morrison explained the human position to Zekthara. "Commander, we appreciate the Council's concern, but this situation is under control. The Veltar want to fight a war of extermination against civilians. We're going to give them exactly what they asked for." Zekthara was confused by this response. "Admiral, the Veltar have superior numbers and technology. They are preparing to use forbidden weapons against your colonies. How can you be confident of victory?" Morrison's smile was cold. "Because they don't understand what they're fighting. Commander, the Veltar think warfare is about breaking your enemy's will to resist. They use brutality to make their victims give up hope. What they don't realize is that humans get more dangerous when you take away our hope. We fight harder when we have nothing left to lose." The next Veltar assault targeted the human colony on New Texas. Thokavai personally commanded the attack and used nerve agents banned by every civilized species in the galaxy. The chemical weapons killed 800,000 human civilians in agonizing deaths that were broadcast across human communication networks. The War Master expected this demonstration of Veltar power to break human resistance completely. Instead, it accomplished the opposite. Zekthara watched from Coalition Command as human military doctrine underwent a fundamental transformation. Admiral Morrison issued new orders to all human forces, the Geneva Conventions and other humanitarian agreements that humans had followed. For centuries were formally suspended. All captured Veltar personnel would be transferred to special facilities for enhanced interrogation. No quarter would be given to enemy forces under any circumstances. Most disturbing to Coalition observers, Morrison announced that humanity was withdrawing from all galactic warfare conventions. Human forces would no longer be bound by restrictions on biological weapons, psychological warfare, or treatment of prisoners. If the Veltar wanted to fight without rules, then humans would accommodate them. Captain Ryan Foster was placed in command of human military operations with orders to end the Veltar threat permanently. Foster had commanded Special Operations Forces during Earth's last major conflicts and understood warfare in ways that made even Kitherian veterans uncomfortable. His first action was to request detailed biological data on Veltar physiology and psychology. Within days, human ships began appearing throughout Veltar space. These were not the slow, primitive vessels that Coalition observers expected. Somehow the humans had developed new propulsion systems and weapons technologies in just weeks. More importantly, they were using tactics that violated every accepted principle of civilized warfare. Zekthara received reports of human forces broadcasting the screams of tortured Veltar prisoners across enemy communication networks. Human boarding parties were taking enemy ships intact and converting them into mobile execution platforms. Most disturbing, humans had begun developing biological weapons that targeted Veltar reproductive systems and would prevent future generations from being born. When Coalition delegates demanded explanations for these actions, Morrison's response was simple and terrifying. The Veltar declared war on human civilians and children. They chose to fight without honor or mercy. Now they get to discover what humans are like when we stop pretending to be civilized. Zekthara realized that he had completely misunderstood what humanity represented. The peaceful colonists and enthusiastic allies he had observed were not the true face of human nature. They were the carefully controlled public face of a species that had spent millennia learning to wage war against itself. The images from New Texas arrived at Coalition Command 18 hours after the nerve gas attack. Zekthara watched the recordings with growing horror as Veltar soldiers in protective suits moved through streets filled with human bodies. Men, women, and children lay where they had died in convulsions of agony, while Veltar commanders broadcast triumphant messages to their fleet. War Master Thokvai had specifically ordered the attack to be recorded and transmitted across human space as a demonstration of Veltar power. 800,000 civilians had died in 6 hours of chemical warfare that violated every galactic convention. The nerve agents used were specifically designed to cause maximum suffering before death. Children had died in their parents' arms while Veltar soldiers watched and laughed. The recordings showed Veltar officers posing for photographs among the bodies while their ships prepared to bombard the next human colony. Admiral Morrison arrived at Coalition Command 3 days later to address the emergency session called by the Council. Zekthara had expected to see grief or rage in the Admiral's expression, but instead found something far more disturbing. Morrison appeared completely calm as he reviewed the footage from New Texas. He took notes during the presentations and asked technical questions about Veltar chemical weapons capabilities. His demeanor suggested he was studying enemy tactics rather than mourning the dead. When Council Chairman Velkara called for immediate intervention to stop the escalating atrocities, Morrison stood to address the assembly. Representatives from dozens of species listened in silence as the human admiral spoke in measured tones about galactic law and military conventions. His words were reasonable and diplomatic, but something in his voice made Zekathara's combat instincts trigger warning signals. "Honorable delegates," Morrison began, "humanity appreciates your concern for our welfare and your offers of military assistance. However, this situation requires a specifically human response. The Veltar have chosen to abandon all pretense of civilized warfare. They are murdering our children with forbidden weapons and broadcasting their crimes as entertainment. This cannot be tolerated." Morrison activated a holographic display showing official human military documents. "Effective immediately, humanity is formally withdrawing from all galactic warfare conventions. The Geneva Conventions, the Treaty of Cosmic Warfare, and all related humanitarian agreements are hereby suspended for the duration of this conflict. Human forces will no longer be bound by restrictions on biological weapons, psychological warfare, or treatment of prisoners." The council chamber erupted in protests and demands for clarification. Several delegates argued that withdrawing from warfare conventions would make humans no better than the Veltar themselves. Others worried that abandoning legal restraints would escalate the conflict beyond all control. Morrison listened to these objections with patience, then delivered his response. "Distinguished colleagues, you seem to believe that humans follow warfare conventions because we lack the ability to fight without them. This is incorrect. We follow rules in warfare because we choose to limit ourselves. The Veltar have demonstrated that they prefer conflicts without rules. We will accommodate their preference." Chairman Velkara attempted to maintain order as Morrison continued his presentation. "The Veltar leadership believes they understand warfare because they have conquered primitive species and enslaved defenseless populations. They measure their success by the suffering they inflict rather than the objectives they achieve. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what war actually represents." Morrison's expression became colder as he reached the core of his message. "War is not about causing pain or demonstrating dominance. War is about imposing your will on an enemy who refuses to accept it voluntarily. The Veltar want to fight a war of extermination against human civilians. They have made their choice. Now they will discover what happens when humans decide to win at any cost." Zekathara felt his warrior instincts react to something dangerous in Morrison's tone. In 3 centuries of combat experience, he had learned to recognize when an opponent was genuinely deadly rather than merely aggressive. Morrison spoke with the calm confidence of someone who possessed overwhelming superiority and was simply explaining how he intended to use it. The human admirals' final statement to the council was delivered with bureaucratic politeness that made it even more disturbing. "Humanity formally notifies the coalition that we will no longer observe restrictions on our military capabilities. Any species that continues to trade with or support the Veltar hegemony will be considered hostile to human interests. We suggest that neutral parties maintain their distance from the combat zone for their own safety." Within hours of Morrison's announcement, human ships began appearing throughout Veltar space using propulsion technology that should not have existed. These vessels moved faster than Coalition scouts and carried weapons that could penetrate Veltar shields. More importantly, they were operating with tactical coordination that suggested years of preparation rather than hasty mobilization. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the human fleet with orders to end the Veltar threat permanently. Foster had spent his career developing strategies for fighting superior forces, and his approach to the current conflict reflected that experience. Rather than engaging Veltar ships in direct combat, he targeted their support infrastructure and supply lines. Veltar fleets found themselves stranded without fuel or reinforcements, while human forces methodically destroyed their ability to continue fighting. The psychological warfare that humans employed was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. Foster's forces captured Veltar communication networks and broadcast the sounds of dying soldiers across enemy space. Veltar officers woke to find their personal quarters filled with recordings of their own screams from interrogation sessions. Most disturbing, Humans began using Veltar family structures against them by threatening biological warfare against their breeding colonies. Zekthara monitored these developments from Coalition Command and realized that human military doctrine had evolved far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The primitive colonists who had defended Kepler Station had been replaced by sophisticated forces that understood warfare at levels that challenged even Cytherian tactical thinking. More importantly, the humans were demonstrating capabilities. That suggested they had been preparing for large-scale conflict long before joining the coalition. Major Katie Wells led human ground forces that specialized in what they called total warfare. Wells had developed techniques for breaking enemy morale that went far beyond conventional psychological operations. Her forces would capture Veltar installations intact, then convert them into broadcasting stations that transmitted the interrogation and execution of prisoners to other enemy units. The goal was not just military victory, but complete psychological destruction of Veltar fighting capacity. The biological weapons that humans developed targeted Veltar physiology with surgical precision. Rather than creating simple toxins that killed quickly, human scientists designed organisms that caused prolonged suffering while broadcasting the victim's location to nearby forces. Veltar soldiers began surrendering not to avoid death, but to avoid the specific types of death that humans had created for them. Commander Dan Foster, Ryan's younger brother, specialized in what humans called mercy warfare. His units would offer Veltar forces the opportunity to surrender under reasonable terms. When enemy commanders refused these offers, Dan's forces would demonstrate exactly what the alternative looked like. Entire Veltar fleets began surrendering after witnessing the systematic destruction of units that chose to continue fighting. War Master Thok Vai attempted to rally his forces by promising greater rewards for victory and more brutal punishments for failure. Instead, he discovered that his soldiers were more afraid of capture by humans than execution by their own commanders. Veltar military doctrine had always relied on their reputation for cruelty to intimidate enemies. When faced with opponents who were demonstrably more ruthless than themselves, their entire command structure began to collapse. Zekthara received reports of Veltar commanders requesting transfer to safer assignments rather than face human forces. Elite units that had conquered dozens of worlds were refusing deployment orders rather than risk encounter with human military units. Most significantly, Veltar civilian populations were beginning to question whether their leadership could protect them from human retaliation. The turning point came when human forces captured the Veltar research facility that had developed the nerve agents used on New Texas. Rather than simply destroying the installation, human scientists reverse-engineered the weapons and created improved versions specifically designed to target Veltar biology. The message was clear. Anything the Veltar could do to humans, humans could do better to the Veltar. When Zekthara reviewed the intelligence reports from this operation, he finally understood what Morrison had meant about humans choosing to limit themselves. The speed and sophistication of human weapons development suggested capabilities that had been deliberately hidden. The humans had not suddenly become dangerous, they had simply stopped pretending to be harmless. As Veltar resistance began to crumble throughout their empire, Zekthara. The surrender offer arrived at Coalition Command on a heavily encrypted Veltar diplomatic channel. War Master Thok Vai was requesting immediate ceasefire negotiations through neutral coalition mediators. The message included detailed proposals for reparations, territorial concessions, and formal acknowledgement of human sovereignty over disputed space. For the first time in their 1,000-year history, the Veltar hegemony was attempting to surrender. Zekthara studied the diplomatic documents with growing amazement. The Veltar had built their empire on the principle that surrender was weakness and mercy was foolishness. They had never offered terms to any enemy and had rejected every attempt at negotiated settlement throughout their expansion across the galaxy. The fact that they were now begging for peace talks represented a fundamental shift in galactic power that no one had anticipated. Admiral Morrison's response was delivered through official coalition channels within 6 hours. The message was brief and left no room for interpretation. Surrender was available before the Veltar began murdering children with chemical weapons. That option is no longer offered. Human forces will continue operations until the Veltar threat is permanently eliminated. The implications of Morrison's refusal sent shockwaves through Coalition Command. Every previous galactic conflict had ended with negotiated settlements that preserved some version of the losing side's political structure. The idea that humans intended to completely destroy an enemy empire rather than simply defeat it violated centuries of established diplomatic precedent. More disturbing was the casual tone Morrison used when explaining that mercy was no longer available. Captain Ryan Foster had been promoted to overall command of human military operations with explicit orders to end the Veltar threat permanently. Foster's approach to this mission reflected a level of strategic thinking that impressed even Catherian military analysts. Rather than simply conquering Veltar territory, he was systematically dismantling their entire civilization while keeping the population alive to witness their empire's destruction. Human forces had captured the Veltar capital world without firing a shot. Foster's psychological warfare specialists had convinced the planetary defense forces that resistance would result in the complete sterilization of their homeworld. When Veltar commanders surrendered expecting traditional occupation terms, they discovered that humans had very different ideas about what conquered territory meant. The humans did not execute Veltar leadership or enslave their population. Instead, they did something far more psychologically devastating. They removed every symbol of Veltar power and replaced them with memorials to the human children killed on New Texas. Veltar government buildings were converted into museums displaying the evidence of their empire's crimes. Most humiliating, former Veltar commanders were required to serve as tour guides explaining their war crimes to visitors from across the galaxy. Major Katie Wells led the occupation forces that specialized in what they called cultural restructuring. Wells had studied Veltar society and understood that their entire identity was built around concepts of dominance and superiority. Her team systematically demolished these concepts by demonstrating human superiority in every aspect of civilization, from technology to military capability to simple organizational efficiency. Veltar children attended schools where they learned that their empire had been built on lies about their own capabilities. Adult Veltar were required to perform community service repairing damage their forces had caused to coalition worlds. Most psychologically damaging, Veltar scientists were forced to study human technology and acknowledge that their supposedly advanced civilization had been centuries behind human capabilities. The speed and efficiency of this cultural transformation shocked coalition observers. Within months, populations that had considered themselves the galaxy's master race were accepting human authority as natural and inevitable. Veltar citizens began requesting permission to emigrate to human-controlled space where they could contribute to what they now recognized as a superior civilization. Zekathara traveled to the former Veltar capital to witness this transformation personally. What he found was unlike any military occupation in galactic history. The humans had not destroyed Veltar infrastructure or displaced their population. Instead, they had simply demonstrated so completely that human civilization was superior that Veltar resistance collapsed from within. Commander Dan Foster explained the occupation strategy during a briefing for coalition observers. We could have killed every Veltar in the galaxy, and that would have ended the immediate threat. But dead enemies sometimes become martyrs for future generations. Defeated enemies who acknowledge their defeat become permanent examples of why resistance is futile. The psychological impact of Veltar defeat was spreading throughout the galaxy faster than news of their military collapse. Species that had planned aggressive expansion were quietly canceling their military buildups. The Xanth Collective had withdrawn their invasion fleets from border regions. Even the proud Hrek Empire was requesting diplomatic meetings to clarify their relationship with human space. Most significantly, Catherian warhouses were debating whether their traditional warrior culture needed fundamental revision. If humans could defeat the Veltar so completely using methods that Catherians had never considered, then perhaps there were aspects of warfare that his people had failed to understand. Zekthara found himself questioning assumptions about combat that had guided his species for millennia. Warmaster Thokvai had fled to the galactic rim with the remnants of his personal guard when it became clear that surrender would not be accepted. Human intelligence forces tracked his movements, but made no attempt to capture him. Foster explained that Thokvai served a useful purpose as a living reminder of what happened to leaders who chose to fight humanity. His exile was more valuable than his execution would have been. The final Veltar resistance ended when their remaining fleets realized that continued fighting would only make their eventual defeat more humiliating. Human forces had demonstrated the ability to capture any ship they chose while leaving the crew alive to serve as witnesses to their own incompetence. Veltar commanders began surrendering their vessels voluntarily rather than risk the psychological destruction that came with military defeat. When Coalition representatives asked how humans had achieved such overwhelming victory so quickly, Morrison's explanation was characteristically direct. The Veltar assumed that warfare was about inflicting maximum damage on your enemies. They measured success by body counts and territorial conquest. This is primitive thinking that ignores the real purpose of military force. Morrison continued, his explanation with the patient tone of a teacher addressing slow students. Effective warfare is about imposing your will on opponents who refuse to accept it voluntarily. Sometimes this requires killing them, but more often it simply requires demonstrating that resistance is more costly than compliance. The Veltar chose to fight because they believed they were stronger than us. We corrected their misunderstanding. Zekthara requested a private meeting with Morrison to understand how humans had hidden such sophisticated military capabilities. The Admiral's response was both enlightening and terrifying. Commander, we didn't hide our capabilities. We simply chose not to advertise them. Humans have been fighting wars against each other for thousands of years. We developed every weapon and tactic you've seen used against the Veltar during conflicts on our own world. Morrison's final comment explained everything that Zekthara had witnessed. The difference between human warfare and what other species practice is that we learn to fight against opponents who were as intelligent and creative as ourselves. Every human military doctrine assumes that the enemy is capable of learning and adapting because that's what we faced in our own wars. The Veltar never fought anyone who could match their capabilities, so they never learned how to deal with superior opponents. As Zekthara prepared his final report on the Veltar War, he realized that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. The humans had not simply won a military victory, they had demonstrated capabilities that redefined what warfare meant. More importantly, they had done it while maintaining complete emotional control and strategic discipline. There had been no rage, no dramatic speeches, no appeals to honor or glory. Just cold, methodical application of superior force until the enemy no longer existed as a threat. The most disturbing aspect was how easily humans had transitioned from peaceful colonists to galactic conquerors and back to peaceful traders. The same individuals who had systematically destroyed the Veltar Empire were now offering technical assistance to help rebuild their former enemy's civilization. It was as if the capacity for total warfare was simply another tool that humans could use when necessary, then set aside when the job was finished. Other species throughout the galaxy were learning the lesson that the Veltar had learned too late. Humans were not the harmless newcomers they appeared to be. They were apex predators who had learned to disguise their true nature behind friendly smiles and diplomatic courtesy. That disguise was entirely voluntary and could be removed whenever circumstances required it. 6 months after the last Veltar stronghold surrendered, Zekthara sat in his private quarters aboard the Coalition flagship, reviewing the final intelligence reports. The Veltar hegemony no longer existed as a political entity. Their former territories had been divided between independent governments and coalition protectorates. War Master Thokvai was still alive somewhere in the Galactic Rim, but commanded nothing more than a handful of loyal followers and a single damaged cruiser. The transformation had been so complete that younger coalition citizens were already forgetting that the Veltar had ever been considered a serious threat. History texts would record their defeat in clinical terms that failed to capture the psychological impact of watching an empire simply cease to exist. More significantly, the defeat had been achieved without massive casualties or widespread destruction. The humans had somehow managed to eliminate their enemies while leaving their civilization intact enough to be rebuilt under better leadership. Zekthara had spent weeks compiling his official report for Coalition Command. The document would become required reading for military officers throughout Coalition space because it challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare that had guided galactic thinking for centuries. Most importantly, it forced military planners to reconsider what they thought they knew about human capabilities and intentions. The statistical summary was remarkable enough. Human forces had destroyed 3 battle groups at Kepler Station, defeated simultaneous attacks on 6 colonies, captured the Veltar capital without significant resistance, and occupied their entire empire in less than 4 months. Enemy military. Casualties were estimated at over 2 million, while human losses remained classified but were believed to be minimal. More impressive than the casualty figures was the speed of cultural transformation in former Veltar space. Populations that had considered themselves the galaxy's master race were now cooperating enthusiastically with human administrators. Former Veltar scientists were contributing to coalition research projects, while their military officers served as advisors, helping other species understand the strategic mistakes that had led to their empire's collapse. The psychological impact extended far beyond former Veltar territory. Species throughout the galaxy had quietly revised their military doctrines and diplomatic strategies to account for human capabilities. The Xanth Collective had formally requested friendship treaties with humanity. The Rek Empire was negotiating technology-sharing agreements. Even proud warrior cultures like the Kitherians were acknowledging that humans represented a new paradigm in galactic military thinking. Admiral Morrison had returned to Earth after the war ended and resumed his role as head of the Terran Defense Force. His transition from galactic conqueror back to peaceful administrator was so seamless that it seemed almost casual. When Coalition representatives asked about human plans for further expansion, Morrison's response was characteristically direct. "Humanity has no interest in conquest, Commander. We simply wanted the Veltar to stop murdering our civilians. That problem has been solved." Zekthara had requested a final meeting with Morrison to clarify questions that still puzzled Coalition leadership. The conversation took place in Morrison's office on Earth, overlooking the same blue oceans that Zekthara had observed during first contact. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the recent demonstration of human military power was deliberately ironic. "Admiral," Zekthara began, "Coalition analysts are still trying to understand how humans developed such sophisticated military capabilities so quickly. Your species went from primitive colonists to galactic superpower in less than 6 months. How was this possible?" Morrison's smile was genuinely amused. "Commander, I think you're misunderstanding the timeline. Humans didn't develop these capabilities recently. We've had them for centuries. The question isn't how we became dangerous so quickly, but why we spent so long pretending to be harmless." The Admiral gestured toward historical displays that showed Earth's military history. "My species fought 2 world wars that killed over 100 million people. We developed nuclear weapons capable of destroying our own planet. We created biological and chemical weapons that could eliminate entire populations. We did all of this while fighting against opponents who were exactly as intelligent and creative as ourselves. Morrison continued his explanation with the patient tone he used when addressing coalition concerns. When humans joined the coalition, we made a deliberate choice to limit our military activities to defensive operations. We wanted to be good neighbors and contribute to galactic peace. The Veltar mistake was assuming that our restraint indicated weakness rather than conscious choice. Zekthara felt compelled to ask the question that had been troubling him since Kepler Station. But Admiral, the tactics your forces used against the Veltar were unlike anything in coalition military doctrine. The psychological warfare, the biological weapons, the systematic destruction of enemy morale. Where did these strategies come from? Morrison's expression became more serious. They came from human history, Commander. Every weapon we used against the Veltar was originally developed for use against other humans. Every tactic we employed had been tested in conflicts on our own world. The difference is that when humans fight each other, we're evenly matched. When we fight species who have never faced opponents as capable as themselves, the results are predictably one-sided. The most disturbing part of Morrison's explanation was his matter-of-fact tone. The Veltar built their empire by conquering species who were technologically or militarily inferior. They never learned how to fight against equals because they never encountered any. When they attacked humanity, they expected to face another primitive species. Instead, they found themselves fighting against predators who had spent millennia learning to kill their own kind. Zekthara posed the final question that coalition leadership needed answered. Admiral, what are human intentions now that the Veltar threat has been eliminated? Will humanity seek to expand its territory or influence? Morrison's response provided the reassurance that coalition leaders were hoping for, while simultaneously delivering a warning that no one could ignore. Commander, humans are fundamentally peaceful. We prefer trade to conquest and cooperation to domination. We will continue to be valuable allies and responsible members of the galactic community. The Admiral paused before delivering the implicit threat that made his peaceful words even more significant. However, humanity will no longer tolerate attacks on our civilians or attempts to enslave our people. Any species that chooses to test our defensive capabilities will discover exactly what the Veltar learned. We hope that won't be necessary. As Zekthara prepared to leave Earth, he realized that the galaxy had entered a new era. The balance of power had shifted so dramatically that entire species were revising their long-term strategies to accommodate human preferences. More importantly, the demonstration of human military capabilities had established precedents that would influence galactic politics for generations to come. The final section of Zekthara's report contained his recommendations for coalition policy toward humanity. Humans should be granted immediate recognition as a Tier 1 military power with all associated privileges and responsibilities. Their request for expanded territory and resources should be approved without hesitation. Most importantly, coalition members should understand that human restraint is a choice rather than a limitation. Zekthara's concluding assessment would be quoted in military academies throughout coalition space for decades to come. The greatest threat to galactic peace is not human aggression but human defensive capabilities. Any species foolish enough to attack human civilians will face consequences that exceed their ability to comprehend or survive. It is not their fury we should fear, but their mercy. When that mercy ends, so does everything else. The report's final paragraph contained an observation that captured the fundamental change in galactic thinking that human military performance had created. Humanity represents the most dangerous force in known space, precisely because they choose to limit that danger to defensive applications. Their restraint is what makes them trustworthy allies. Their capabilities are what make them invaluable friends. Their demonstrated willingness to remove all limitations when sufficiently provoked is what makes them the ultimate guarantors of galactic peace. As his ship left Earth's orbit for the final time, Zekthara watched the blue planet fade into the distance and reflected on how completely his understanding of warfare had changed. 6 months ago, he had considered himself an expert on military strategy with 3 centuries of combat experience. Now he understood that he had been studying primitive conflict while humans had mastered the advanced version. The galaxy was safer now, but not because any external threat had been eliminated. It was safer because the most dangerous species in known space had proven that they could be trusted to use their power responsibly. The Veltar had learned too late that attacking humanity was not just militarily futile, but existentially stupid. Other species were learning the same lesson through observation rather than experience. In his private log entry that night, Zekthara wrote the conclusion that would define his remaining years as a military observer.